Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The sky above Ethan South's village had turned to an eternal shade of dull gray. No birds flew overhead anymore, and no animals dared approach the ruined fields that surrounded his home. What was left of the town was barricaded and fortified, but it didn't entirely look like a fortress. It looked like a tomb. The once vibrant village where he'd grown up had been reduced to a series of makeshift barricades, crumbling walls, and debris scattered through the street. The air tasted of ash and burnt wood, a permanent reminder of the last raid that had nearly destroyed them. Ethan Millers stood atop the highest ridge, scanning the horizon through the cracked lens of an old pair of binoculars. His breath came slow and steady, but his muscles remained tense. The distant outline of an enemy scout skittered across his field of view, moving along the edge of the valley below. The Eastern Coalition was sending out more patrols than usual, and that meant trouble. The underground energy reserve buried beneath their village had been a secret for years, but now everyone seemed to know. He lowered the binoculars and slid them into his pack, his jaw clenched tight. For weeks they had been able to fend off the smaller groups, bandits, looters, those desperate enough to fight for scraps. But this was different. This was organized. The coalition wanted what was beneath their feet, and they wouldn't stop until they got it. Sarah, his sister, climbed up the ridge to join him, her face pale and drawn. She was a few years younger than him, but the strain of the constant war had made her look older. Her eyes, once bright and filled with hope, now mirrored the bleak landscape around them. "They're moving closer," she said softly, adjusting the frayed scarf around her neck to block out the chill. "We can't keep this up much longer, Ethan. The village, it's falling apart." Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let his gaze fall over the village below them. His people were broken, exhausted from years of scraping by on what little food and water they had left. Supplies were dwindling, and morale was at an all-time low. He saw children helping their parents repair the barricades, the older folks sitting quietly by the fire, their faces etched with hopelessness. "I know," he muttered finally, "but we have to hold on. As long as we keep them at bay, we have a chance." "If they get through," he didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what it would mean. The coalition would seize the energy reserves, and their village would be wiped off the map, either by battle or by being abandoned in the aftermath. Sarah looked at him, her voice catching slightly. "We should try to negotiate. Maybe they will listen to reason." "Reason?" Ethan barked a bitter laugh. "You think General Victorilian listens to reason? He's not interested in negotiation. He wants control, and control comes with crushing anyone in his way." Sarah flinched at his tone, but she didn't back down. "I know what he sounds like, but if we don't try, we'll all be dead. What's the point of fighting if there's no one left to protect?" Ethan didn't have an answer for her, not one that would ease the burden she carried. He raked a hand through his hair, trying to think of a way out of this mess. Every day felt like another step toward the inevitable. The only reason the coalition hadn't attacked full force yet was because of their sabotage efforts, the supply lines they'd managed to disrupt, the traps they'd set in the outer fields. But those tactics wouldn't hold much longer. "We'll find a way," he promised her, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. As they descended the ridge, a figure emerged from the shadows, moving with the practiced stealth of someone who had lived outside the confines of law and order for a long time. Lila Harper, she was a resource looter, a scavenger who lived by her wits and her ability to navigate the ruins of the old world. Ethan didn't trust her, not entirely, but he couldn't deny that she had been useful since she'd arrived. "Looks like the coalition is gearing up for something big," Layla said, her voice as casual as if she were talking about the weather. "Saw some of their equipment moving into position. Heavy artillery. They were not playing around." Ethan exchanged a glance with Sarah, the unspoken fear between them growing heavier by the second. If they brought in heavy artillery, their defenses wouldn't hold for long. Lila leaned against the wall of a nearby building, brushing a strand of dirty blonde hair out of her face. "But I think I got an idea. You want like it, but it could work." Ethan crossed his arms. Let Sarah hear it. Lila grinned, but it was the kind of smile that never reached her eye. "The coalition supply line runs through the valley. They've got ammo, food, and enough fuel to keep their tanks rolling. I know a way in an old service tunnel from before the collapse. If we sabotage the line, we can delay their attack, maybe even force them to pull back." Sarah looked uneasy. "And what's in it for you?" Lila shrugged. Same as you. I don't want to be under Victor's boot. Besides, if they take this place, I'll have nowhere to go, and I am betting that energy reserve you've got stashed under this dirt is worth more than a few tanks of gas. Ethan's mind raced. It was a risky move, one that could get them all killed if it went wrong. But they were running out of options. He could feel the pressure closing in from all sides, and the weight of responsibility hung heavy on his shoulder. He looked to Sarah, hoping for a sign that she agreed with the plan. Her expression was conflicted, torn between wanting to protect their home and the danger that Lila's proposal posed. We don't have much of a choice, Sarah said quietly. If we do nothing, they'll crush us. But if this works, we might buy ourselves more time. Ethan nodded. His decision made. Fine, we will go at nightfall. Lila straightened up, a flash of approval in her eyes. Smart choice, I'll get my gear ready. As she disappeared into the shadows, Ethan felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for Sarah, for the people in the village who depended on him to make the right choices. But with every passing hour, those choices became harder to make. The night was still, almost unnervingly. So Ethan crouched behind a pile of rubble with Lila and Sarah by his side, the cool air biting at his skin. The service tunnel Lila had mentioned was hidden behind an overgrown mound of debris, half buried by time and neglect. We go in quietly, Lila whispered, her breath barely visible in the dim light. We get to their supplies, plant the charges, and get out. No heroic. Ethan gave a curt nod, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. Their one chance to strike back before the full might of the coalition came crashing down on them. Lila led the way, slipping into the tunnel with the ease of someone who had navigated forgotten paths for years. Ethan followed closely behind, his senses alert for any sign of danger. The tunnel was cramped and smelled of mold and decay, but it provided the cover they needed. Sarah was right behind him, her hand resting on the old pistol she carried. They moved quickly, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that had settled in the tunnel over the years. The distant hum of the coalition ascend machinery grew louder as they neared the end of the passage, and Ethan saw his pulse quicken. Lila stopped at the mouth of the tunnel, peeking out into the valley beyond. Rows of supply trucks and ammunition crates were neatly lined up, guarded by only a handful of soldiers. The coalition had gotten overconfident, assuming that no one would be foolish enough to attack their supply line this deep in enemy territory. All right, Lila whispered, we've got 5 minutes to plant the charges and get out of here. Ethan's hands shook slightly as he pulled the small explosives from his pack, but he forced himself to stay calm. They had come too far to screw this up now. Moving with practiced efficiency, they split up, each of them planting charges at key points along the supply line. Ethan could feel the weight of every second ticking by as he worked, his mind racing with the possibility of being discovered. Finally, they were done. Ethan signaled to Sarah and Lila, and they began to retreat back into the tunnel. But just as they reached the entrance, a shout rang out. One of the soldiers had spotted them. Esteo, Ethan hissed, shoving Sarah forward. They bolted down the tunnel, the sound of gunfire echoing behind them as the coalition soldiers opened fire. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest, every muscle in his body screaming for him to move faster. Behind them, the charges exploded, sending a deafening roar through the valley. Flames shot into the sky as the coalition's supplies went up in smoke. But Ethan barely had time to register the success. They had to get out before the soldiers caught up. They burst out of the tunnel and into the night, but their path back to the village was entirely clear. Ethan glanced at Lila, who was already scanning the terrain ahead. We need to move fast, she muttered, her voice taut with urgency. They sprinted through the rocky terrain, dodging fallen debris and abandoned machinery as they raced back toward the village. The explosion had worked as planned. The coalition supplies were in flames, and the chaos would slow their advance. But it had also drawn attention, and Ethan could hear the shouts of soldiers in the distance. They were coming after them. Sarah stumbled on a loose rock, but Ethan was quick to grab her arm, pulling her back to her feet. Keep moving, he urged, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His legs burned from the effort. But the adrenaline pushed him forward. He couldn't let them get caught. Not now. Lila took the lead, weaving through the maze of rubble with the precision of someone who had spent years navigating dangerous territory. and then the shadows that stretched out around them. Every dark corner felt like a potential ambush, every sound like the approach of an enemy. They reached the outskirts of the village just as the first rays of dawn began to break over the horizon. The sky was still a murky gray, but the faint light brought with it a sense of temporary safety. Ethan slowed his pace, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they weren't being followed. The coalition soldiers had been thrown into disarray by the explosion, and for now it seemed they weren't pursuing. "We made it," Sarah breathed, her voice shaky with relief. Ethan nodded, though the tension in his chest hadn't eased for now. They slipped through the barricades surrounding the village, greeted by the wary stares of the remaining fighters who had kept watch through the night. Most of them were older, too weak to fight on the front lines, but determined to do whatever they could to protect their home. They nodded to Ethan as he passed, their expressions grim. Word of the sabotage would spread quickly, and the villagers would know that the real battle was only just beginning. Lila lingered near the edge of the barricade, watching as Ethan helped Sarah down from a crumbling wall. "We bought ourselves some time," she said quietly, "but it won be enough." Sigh, not the type to back down after a hit like that. Ethan shot her a sharp look. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that the next time he comes, he'll come with everything he's got, and this place won't stand a chance." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Sarah muttered, her voice laced with sarcasm. Lila shrugged. "I am just telling it like it is. You're outmatched, outgunned, and running on borrowed time. You need a backup plan." Ethan frowned, his mind already racing through their options. She wasn't Tidong. The sabotage had delayed the coalition as to advance, but it hadn't stopped it. Sooner or later, Vicorta would regroup, and when he did, he'd come with enough force to wipe their village off the map. "I'll figure something out," Ethan said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Lila raised an eyebrow. "You better, because next time there won't be any tunnels to hide it." With that, she turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Ethan and Sarah standing alone near the barricade. Ethan watched her go, his jaw clenched. He didn't trust Lila, not fully, but she had a point. If they didn't come up with a plan soon, everything they had fought for would be lost. As the village began to stir with the arrival of morning, Ethan made his way back to the small building that had once been his family. So it was barely recognizable now, just a skeleton of its former self, with most of the walls crumbling and the roof partially caved in, but it was still standing, and that was something. Inside, he found a few of the village chef's remaining fighters gathered around a makeshift table, discussing their next move. Their faces were etched with fatigue and worry, but they straightened up when Ethan entered the room. They looked to him for guidance, for leadership. He had become their de facto leader, though he had never asked for the role. "We've bought ourselves some time," Ethan began, leaning against the edge of the table. "But it's not going to be enough. The coalition will regroup, and when they do, they'll come at us harder than before." One of the older fighters, a grizzled man named Hank, nodded grimly. "We figured as much. What's the plan?" Ethan rubbed a hand over his face, trying to think. "We need to fortify our defenses, set more traps. We'll use the sabotage to our advantage and make them pay for every inch they try to take." "And what about the people?" Sarah asked from the doorway, her voice soft but firm. "We can just keep fighting. We need to think about evacuating." Hank shook his head. "Evacuate to where there's nowhere to go. The whole world says in the same shape we are. If we leave this place, we'll be out there fighting for scraps with the rest of the scavengers." She said right, though. Another fighter, a younger man named Cole, chimed in. "We can try to hold out forever. If the coalition gets their hands on that energy reserve, it's over for all of us." Ethan's mind whirled with conflicting thoughts. He knew they couldn't fight forever. The village's resources were stretched thin, and morale was at its breaking point. But he couldn't bring himself to accept defeat. Not yet. "We were not evacuating," Ethan said finally, his voice firm. "Not unless we absolutely have to. We will prepare for the worst, but we'll fight like hell to keep this place standing. We have something they want that gives us leverage." The fighters exchanged uncertain glances, but no one argued. They had followed Ethan this far, and for better or worse, they would follow him into the final battle. Hours passed in a blur of preparation. Ethan and the remaining fighters worked tirelessly to reinforce the barricades, setting traps in the fields surrounding the village and stockpiling what little ammunition they had left. The air was thick with tension, every breath feeling like it could be their last before the storm hit. As night fell once again, Ethan stood watch on the ridge overlooking the valley, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The village below him was eerily quiet, the people huddled in their homes, waiting for the inevitable. Lila appeared beside him, her footsteps as silent as ever. "You really think you can win this?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched the stars flicker faintly in the sky, wondering how many other villages were out there fighting their own desperate battles for survival. "I have to believe we can," he said finally, "otherwise, what's the point?" Lila chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. That's the thing about hope. It has a dangerous weapon, cuts both ways. Ethan glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "Why are you still here, Layla? You don't owe us anything." She shrugged, her expression unreadable. "Maybe I am just curious to see how this all plays out." They stood in silence for a moment longer before Lila spoke again, her tone more serious. "Victor one T stop. You know that, right? Even if you beat him here, he'll keep coming. People like him, they don't know how to quit." Ethan nodded. "So what's the plan then? You gonna fight him forever?" Ethan didn't answer. The truth was, he didn't know what the future held. All he knew was that he couldn't control Victor win. Not here, not now. The faint sound of engines echoed through the valley, and Ethan's pulse quickened. They were coming. The final battle was about to begin. Without a word, Ethan turned and headed back down the ridge, his heart pounding in his chest. The time for planning was over. Now it was all about survival. The engines grew louder, a constant hum that vibrated through the ground, signaling the approach of the Eastern Coalition. Ethan's heart thudded in sync with the noise, his body tense as he descended the ridge back to the village. The night sky had clouded over, dark and heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the coming storm. Down below the village was a hive of nervous activity. Fighters moved into their positions, checking weapons and adjusting barricades. Sarah was among them, distributing last-minute supplies and offering words of reassurance to the villagers who had taken shelter in the center of town. Most of them were too old or too young to fight, but their fear was palpable. They knew what was coming. Ethan found himself at Sarah's side, his hand resting on her shoulder as they stood together in the shadow of what was once their family home. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of determination and fear. "You ready for this?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded, though her voice trembled slightly, "As ready as I'll ever be." Ethan offered her a small, strained smile. "We'll get through this, one way or another." He wasn't sure if he believed his own words, but there was no time for doubt. The sound of engines had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on the village like a heavy blanket. The coalition had arrived. Lila appeared beside them, her eyes scanning the horizon. They were close, she muttered. Too close. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment settling over him, the crushing pressure of responsibility. His fingers tightened around the grip of his rifle, the cold metal grounding him in the chaos. "Everyone to your positions," he called out, his voice firm and steady, masking the dread that gnawed at his inside. The fighters scrambled into place, crouching behind barricades and taking cover in the ruins of the village. The night seemed to stretch on forever, as they waited every second, feeling like an eternity. And then, in the distance, a single flare shot into the sky, casting an unnatural light over the landscape. "They're recoming," Sarah whispered. The first wave of coalition soldiers swept across the valley like a tidal surge, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light. The heavy rumble of tanks followed, their hulking forms emerging from the shadows, cutting a path through the rubble. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat. This was it, the final battle. The village erupted in gunfire as the fighters opened fire, their bullets cutting through the air with a deafening roar. The coalition soldiers returned fire almost immediately, their well-trained forces advancing with terrifying precision. The sound of explosions filled the air as mortars and grenades tore through the barricades, sending clouds of dust and debris into the sky. Ethan moved with practiced efficiency, firing at the advancing soldiers and barking orders to his fighters. The village was a battlefield now, and every inch of ground was being contested with blood and sweat. He could see the tanks rolling in from the east, their cannons blasting through the barricades with ease. "Take out the tanks," Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse from the strain. Lila darted forward, her movements quick and calculated as she threw herself behind a pile of rubble, preparing to launch the explosives they had rigged earlier. Ethan fired at the approaching soldiers, covering her as she worked. The first tank rumbled closer, its cannon swiveling toward the heart of the village. "Now, Lila," Ethan yelled. Lila didn't hesitate. She triggered the detonator, and a series of explosions rocked the battlefield as the traps they had set went off in a chain reaction. The first tank was engulfed in flames, its massive frame crumpling under the force of the blast. A cheer rose from the fighters, but it was short-lived. More tanks were coming. Ethan ducked as a burst of gunfire peppered the ground around him, his heart racing. The coalition forces were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. He could see Vixorces, soldiers pushing forward, gaining ground, despite the resistance. The village was crumbling, their defenses falling apart with every passing minute. Beside him, Sarah fired her pistol with grim determination, her face pale but resolute. Ethan could see the strain in her eyes, the toll the battle was taking on her, but she didn't back down. She wouldn't not when everything they had left was on the line. A sudden explosion rocked the ground near them, and Ethan was thrown off his feet, his vision spinning as he hit the dirt. His ears rang, and for a moment, everything went silent. He struggled to push himself up, his limbs heavy and uncomforted. When his vision cleared, he saw Sarah lying a few feet away, unmoving. "Sarah!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. He crawled toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. She wasn't moving. He reached her side and rolled her over, his hands trembling. Blood trickled down her temple, but she was breathing. Relief washed over him like a tidal wave, but it was short-lived. The battle was closing in around them, and the village was falling. Ethan, Sarah murmured weakly, her eyes fluttering open. "We can't hold them off. We have to go." Ethan shook his head, his jaw clenched. I am not leaving you." "You have to," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the battle. "They'll kill us all. You need to get the others out." Ethan's throat tightened, his chest aching with the weight of her word. He knew she was right. The village was lost, and staying here would only mean more death. But the thought of leaving, of abandoning the place he had fought so hard to protect was almost unbearable. Lila appeared at his side, her face grim. She said, "Right, Ethan? We're out of time. We need to get out of here before Vicator brings in the rest of his forces." Ethan's mind raced, torn between his instinct to fight and the reality of their situation. The battle had been brutal, and they had inflicted heavy losses on the coalition, but it wasn't high enough. Vicator wouldn't stop until every last one of them was dead. With a heavy heart, Ethan made his decision. He hoisted Sarah onto his back, wincing at the strain, and nodded to Lila. "We were pulling out." Lila's expression was unreadable, but she nodded. "I'll cover you get to the evac point." Ethan pushed forward, weaving through the chaos as the village continued to fall apart around him. He could hear the desperate cries of the fighters still holding the line, the sound of gunfire and explosions ringing in his ears. Every step felt like a betrayal, but he knew it was the only way. They reached the edge of the village where a few vehicles had been prepared for a potential evacuation. The remaining villagers, those too weak or injured to fight, were already being loaded into the makeshift convoy. Ethan placed Sarah into the back of one of the vehicles, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what they were leaving behind. "Get them out of here," Ethan said to the driver, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll hold them off as long as I can." The driver nodded, and the vehicles roared to life, speeding away from the doomed village. Ethan stood for a moment, watching them disappear into the distance. Then he turned back toward the battlefield, his rifle in hand. He knew what was coming. The Catarcel forces were too strong, too many. But Ethan wasn't going to let them take his home without a fight. As the coalition forces closed in, Ethan took his position behind the last standing barricade. His body was battered, his strength waning, but his resolve was unshaken. He fired at the approaching soldiers, his every shot a defiant act in the face of overwhelming odds. The tanks rumbled closer, and Ethan could see Vicator's forces advancing, their dark silhouettes moving like shadows across the battlefield. His heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't back down. He would fight until his last breath. The ground shook as the tanks rolled over the barricades, and Ethan's rifle clicked empty. He was out of ammo. With a grim smile, he dropped the weapon and pulled his knife from its sheath. He had always known it would end like this, fighting, bleeding, protecting the people he loved. The first soldier came at him, and Ethan met him, head on, his blade flashing in the dim light. The fight was brutal, messy, and over too quickly, but there were more soldiers coming, and Ethan could feel the exhaustion creeping into his bones. As he fought, his thoughts drifted to Sarah, to the village, to the life they had once known before the world had gone to hell. He had fought so hard to protect them, to keep the last remnants of his home standing. But now, as the battle raged around him, he realized that some things couldn't be saved. Vikator's forces overwhelmed him, and Ethan was knocked to the ground, his vision blurring. He tried to push himself up, but his strength was gone. The world around him faded into darkness as the last remnants of his village fell. In the distance, the convoy carrying Sarah and the others disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind the smoldering remains of the village that had once been their home. Ethan's eyes fluttered closed, a final breath escaping his lips as the battle came to an end. The resource war was over.